Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Tonight's story begins at the edge of the known world, or what once was the edge, a peninsula of mountains and broken coastline, scattered with hundreds of islands, sitting above a sea that was never entirely calm. Thousands of years before the philosophers and the politics and the marble temples, people were already here, building something. They did not yet call themselves Greeks. They did not have a word for what they were becoming, but they were laying the very first stones of a civilization that would eventually shape nearly everything you and I know about the modern world. If this kind of quiet, unhurried storytelling is something you genuinely enjoy, history told slowly, at the end of the day, go ahead and like the video and consider subscribing. And before you settle in completely tonight, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is there. Someone in Auckland at 2 a.m. sitting beside someone in Dublin, winding down after dinner. You are all here for the same reason, and that always makes this a warmer place to be. Now find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. You do not need to be anywhere else or do anything else tonight. We are going all the way back further than Rome, further than the philosophers, further back than Athens herself. Tonight we start at the very beginning of the Greek story, and it is older, stranger, and more human than most people ever get the chance to hear. The story of Greece does not begin with democracy or philosophy or the great marble temples sitting on hilltops above the sea. It begins, almost entirely, with geography. Look at a map of Greece, and you begin to understand nearly everything. There is almost no flat ground. The country is a tangle of mountain ranges and narrow valleys, with a coastline so jagged and irregular that almost every inland community ends up being, somehow, within reach of water. The islands scatter outward into the Aegean by the hundreds, some inhabited for 10,000 years, some barely large enough to name. This particular geography did something to the people who lived there across the centuries. It made them sailors before it made them farmers. It made them traders before it made them soldiers. The mountains divided communities from one another, which meant that neighbouring villages, separated by a ridge of rock, could develop entirely different customs, entirely different loyalties, and later, entirely different systems of government. The sea connected them, but the land kept them apart. That tension between connection and separation would define Greek history for the next 3,000 years. The first great civilization to emerge in this part of the world did not actually begin on the Greek mainland at all. It began on the island of Crete. Around 3000 BC, a people now called the Minoans, a name given to them much later by modern scholars, borrowed from the legend of King Minos, began building something genuinely remarkable on that large southern island. By roughly 2200 BC, they had developed a writing system. By 2000 BC, they had constructed their first palaces. The most celebrated of these was at Knossos, near the northern coast of Crete, and when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans began uncovering it at the turn of the 1900s, what he found astonished him, and continued to astonish every visitor who came after. The palace at Knossos was not a fortress. It had no thick defensive walls, no towers positioned for archers. It was open a maze of corridors, courtyards, storage rooms, and painted halls decorated with images of bulls, dolphins, and young acrobats vaulting through the air in a move that would injure a professional gymnast today. It had indoor plumbing, channels of running water, a drainage system more sophisticated than many European cities would have a full 1500 years later. The Minoans were not, at least in their prime centuries, a people preoccupied with war. They were a people who had decided, for a few remarkable centuries, that trade, administration, and the careful decoration of their walls were more interesting pursuits. Their ships moved regularly across the eastern Mediterranean, carrying pottery, olive oil, and saffron dye. They traded with Egypt. They traded with the cities along the Levantine coast. They had contact with Cyprus and with the islands scattered across the Aegean. The Minoan world, at its height around 1700 BC, was something that might reasonably be called cosmopolitan, a Bronze Age network of commerce and exchange stretching across the entire known sea. And yet they remain, in so many ways, profoundly mysterious. Their writing, the system scholars call Linear A, has never been deciphered. No one today knows what language they spoke. No one knows what they called themselves, how their rulers came to power, or whether the figures presiding over their ceremonies were kings, priests, or something the modern mind does not have a clean category for. Their painted frescoes offer glimpses of a woman in an elaborate layered skirt, her dark curled hair carefully pinned, watching a ceremony in a sunlit courtyard, but she does not speak. She only looks back at us across 4,000 years. Around 1500 BC, something changed. Scholars still disagree about the precise causes. There was a catastrophic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, now called Santorini, one of the most violent eruptions in human history, and its effects on Crete may have been severe. By around 1450 BC, the palace culture of Crete had collapsed, and a different people had moved in. These newcomers used a different script. When that script, called Linear B, was finally decoded in 1952 by a British architect named Michael Ventris, the language it recorded turned out to be an early form of Greek. The people who had moved into Crete and who had already built their own impressive civilization across the Greek mainland were the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaean world differed from the Minoan, one in atmosphere as much as in structure. Where Knossos felt open and almost leisurely, the great citadel of Mycenae felt imposing. It sat on a rocky hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, ringed by walls built from stones so enormous that later Greeks, genuinely unable to imagine how human hands could have lifted them, concluded they must have been built by a race of giants called the Cyclopes. The term held, even today, archaeologists use the word Cyclopean to describe walls built in that style. Whether the Mycenaeans found this reputation flattering or simply convenient is a question history does not answer. Inside those walls, the rulers of Mycenae were buried in deep shaft graves packed with bronze weapons, golden funeral masks, amber jewellery from the Baltic, and cups made of beaten silver. Heinrich Schliemann, the German businessman turned amateur archaeologist who excavated Mycenae in 1876, pulled a golden mask from one of those graves and announced, with tremendous confidence, that he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. It was a wonderful declaration. It was also, as later analysis confirmed, approximately 300 years too early to be Agamemnon. The mask predated any plausible Trojan War by several generations, but it was unquestionably extraordinary, and it remains one of the most recognizable objects in all of ancient history, sitting in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens to this day. The Mycenaean palace economies kept careful administrative records, livestock tallies, grain inventories, lists of bronze weapons, and their conditions all scratched out in that Linear B script on clay tablets. Their kings maintained fleets that crossed the Aegean, built roads linking their major centres, and extended diplomatic contact as far as Egypt and the great Hittite Empire of Anatolia. And somewhere in this period, around 1200 BC, possibly a generation earlier or later, something that may actually have been the Trojan War took place. The city of Troy, on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey, was real. Archaeologists have found several layers of it, each built atop the ruins of an earlier version, stretching back thousands of years. Whether the events that Homer described centuries later bear any real resemblance to whatever conflict actually occurred, no one can say with confidence. But the memory was strong enough to survive 4 centuries of silence and emerge, still vivid, in the earliest poems the Greek world produced. What followed, however, was not a poem. Around 1200 BC, across the entire eastern Mediterranean almost simultaneously, the world that had sustained these civilizations began to come apart. Palace economies collapsed, trade networks dissolved, cities were abandoned or burned, the Hittite Empire disappeared entirely, Egyptian power contracted sharply. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed and never rebuilt. A group referred to in surviving Egyptian records only as the Sea Peoples swept through the region, though whether they were a cause of the collapse or one more consequence of it remains genuinely unclear. Within 2 or 3 generations, the Mycenaean world was gone. The palaces stood empty. The writing stopped. The roads fell into disuse. The careful administrative records that had tracked every sheep and every spear simply ended. The invention of the city-state. By the 8th century BC, the Greek world was doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was expanding. Population growth was the primary engine. Communities that had maintained themselves at a modest scale through the Dark Ages were, by 700 BC, pressing against the limits of what their local land could support. The Greek peninsula was not naturally generous. The soil was thin in most regions, the growing seasons shaped by hot, dry summers and uncertain winter rainfall, and the mountains that divided communities from one another also divided them from the agricultural plains that could have fed larger numbers. When a settlement grew too large for its territory to comfortably sustain, the usual solution was to send a portion of the population away to find somewhere else. This produced one of the most remarkable population movements in ancient history. Between roughly 750 and 550 BC, Greek communities established colonies across the length of the Mediterranean and well into the Black Sea. They settled in Sicily and southern Italy, a region the Romans would later call Magna Graecia, meaning Greater Greece. They planted communities along the coast of what is now France, Spain, and North Africa. They moved eastward into the Black Sea region, founding cities along its northern and eastern coasts. The city of Massalia, on the southern coast of modern France, was founded by Greeks from Phocaea around 600 BC. The city we now call Naples began as a Greek colony, its name Neapolis meaning simply New City. Byzantium, which would later become Constantinople, was founded by colonists from the city of Megara around 650 BC. Each new colony carried something important with it, not just people and tools and agricultural knowledge, but the institution of the polis itself. The colony was not simply a settlement. It was a new city-state, complete with its own laws, its own civic identity, its own assembly. It maintained sentimental and sometimes practical ties to its founding city, what the Greeks called the mother city, or metropolis, but it governed itself. The Greek world of the archaic period was therefore not an empire, not a unified state, and not a federation in any binding sense. It was a vast, loosely connected network of independent communities spread across thousands of miles of coastline, sharing a language and a set of cultural reference points, but owing political allegiance to no central authority. What held this world together, to the extent that anything did, was culture rather than politics. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia in the western Peloponnese, had been established by tradition in 776 BC, the earliest date in Greek history for which a continuous chronological record was maintained. People across the Greek world marked time by the Olympiad. The sanctuary at Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo gave pronouncements that cities and individuals consulted before major decisions, was another binding institution. Delphi belonged to no single polis. It was, in theory, the common property of the Greek world, administered by a council of representatives from different regions. To consult the oracle at Delphi was to participate in something larger than any individual city's concerns. These shared religious institutions gave Greeks a collective name for themselves and a collective name for everyone else. People who shared Greek language and culture were Hellenes. People who did not were barbaroi, a word that carried no automatic insult in its earliest usage, simply describing those whose speech sounded, to Greek ears, like the repeated syllable barbar rather than intelligible words. The idea of a cultural boundary between Greek and non-Greek was firmly in place by the 7th century BC, even though no political boundary existed to enforce it. Within each polis, the question of how to organize political life was being worked out in real time, and the answers varied enormously from one city to another. The typical starting point, in most poleis, was rule by a small group of wealthy landowners, what the Greeks called an aristocracy, a word meaning literally rule by the best, with the definition of best being conveniently determined by the aristocrats themselves. These leading families controlled the best agricultural land, supplied the armies with their most expensive equipment, monopolized access to the legal systems, and passed political authority among themselves through a combination of birth, marriage, and mutual agreement. For most of the early archaic period, this arrangement was simply the way things worked, but the 8th and 7th centuries BC brought changes that put pressure on aristocratic dominance. Population growth meant more people with interests and grievances that aristocratic councils were not well structured to address. The expansion of trade, particularly through the Phoenician-style merchant networks that were bringing new wealth into the Greek world, created a class of people with significant economic resources but no traditional claim to political standing. And the development of a new style of military organization changed the relationship between wealth and military power in ways that had direct political consequences. The military change was the hoplite. A hoplite was a heavily armoured infantry soldier who fought in a close formation called a phalanx, a tight block of men standing shield to shield, each protecting his neighbour's exposed right side with his own shield. The phalanx was devastatingly effective as a military tactic, but it required every man in the formation to hold his position. It depended, in other words, on collective discipline rather than individual heroic performance. The great single combat of the Homeric tradition, two champions meeting in the space between armies, while everyone else watched, had very little place in a phalanx. Equally importantly, hoplite equipment was expensive, but not impossibly so. A bronze helmet, a breastplate, greaves, a shield, and a spear could be purchased by a farmer of moderate means, not just by the very wealthy. This meant that the military defence of a polis increasingly depended on a broad class of middling citizens, landowners, who were not aristocrats, but who were not landless labourers either. Men who equipped themselves for war at their own expense, trained alongside their neighbours, and stood in the line that defended the city, had a reasonable argument to make about what they were owed in return. The tension this created between traditional aristocratic authority and the claims of a broader citizenry generated, across the Greek world, a surprisingly diverse range of political experiments. In some cities it produced reformers figures who rewrote legal codes to make them public, fixed, and applicable to everyone rather than subject to aristocratic interpretation. The city of Athens produced a lawgiver named Draco around 620 BC, whose written legal code was considered such an improvement on the previous system of aristocratic discretion that later generations used his name as a compliment to order and fairness. Then they read the actual laws, discovered that Draco had prescribed the death penalty for an impressively wide range of offences including minor theft, and quietly began using his name in a rather different sense. In other cities, the pressure produced tyrants, a word that in its original Greek usage carried no automatic negative meaning, simply describing a man who seized sole power outside the normal constitutional channels. Many early Greek tyrants were genuinely effective rulers who reduced aristocratic privilege, promoted public building projects, supported trade, and cultivated the loyalty of the non-aristocratic population. Periander of Corinth, who ruled from around 625 to 585 BC, presided over one of the most prosperous periods in that city's history. Corinth, under Periander, controlled key trade routes across the isthmus, connecting central Greece to the Peloponnese, minted coins, and produced pottery that was exported across the Mediterranean. The polis was, therefore, not a fixed or finished thing. It was a framework, a set of shared assumptions about what political life should look like, within which individual cities made their own arrangements, fought their own internal battles, and arrived at their own very different conclusions. Athens and Sparta would become the two most famous examples of where those conclusions could lead, and they would lead in almost entirely opposite directions. But in the 7th century BC, Neither city had yet settled on the arrangement that would make it famous. Athens was a large and wealthy polis, occupying the region of Attica in central Greece, centred on a rocky hill called the Acropolis above a plain that ran down to the coast. It was governed by aristocratic families who dominated the archonship, the chief magistracy of the city and the Areopagus, an ancient council of former magistrates that exercised considerable political and judicial authority. Athens had resources, silver mines at Laurium, good harbour access at the coast, a large agricultural territory, but its politics were fractious, its aristocratic clans competitive to the point of instability, and a growing portion of its population increasingly uncomfortable with arrangements that left them subject to laws they had no hand in making. Sparta, in the southern Peloponnese, had already moved in a direction so distinctive and so different from every other Greek polis that it deserves, and will receive, a section of its own. What the 7th century BC left behind was a Greek world of extraordinary variety, dozens of city-states, each a self-contained experiment in how to organize a community, each watching the others with a mixture of curiosity and competitive suspicion, each convinced that its own way of doing things was, broadly speaking, correct. It was a world without a centre, without a unifying authority, and without any obvious mechanism for resolving the disagreements that were already accumulating between its most powerful members. That variety was both the Greek world's greatest strength and its most persistent vulnerability, Sparta's iron bargain. Every Greek city-state was a political experiment, but Sparta was something closer to a philosophical proposition, an attempt to answer, in permanent and institutional form, the question of what a society would look like if it subordinated absolutely everything to military excellence. The answer turned out to be both impressive and deeply uncomfortable, and the Greeks themselves could never quite decide how to feel about it. Sparta sat in the Eurotas River valley, in the region called Laconia, in the southern Peloponnese, a fertile plain ringed by mountains that gave the city a natural defensiveness without requiring it to ever build the kind of walls that protected other Greek polis. The Spartans were proud of this. Their walls, they said, were their men. It was the sort of remark that sounds better if you do not look too hard at the underlying logic, but it communicated something real about Spartan values and Spartan confidence. The society that would make Sparta famous did not emerge fully formed from some ancient tradition. It was built, deliberately and systematically, in response to a specific historical crisis. Around 740 BC, Sparta conquered the neighbouring region of Messenia, which lay to its west across the Taygetos mountain range. Messenia was fertile agricultural land, and its conquest roughly doubled the territory available to the Spartan state. But the Messenians did not simply accept defeat. Over the course of the 7th century BC, they rose in revolt at least once in a conflict serious enough to threaten Spartan survival. When Sparta finally suppressed the rebellion and reasserted its control, it faced a fundamental problem. It now controlled a large population of subjugated people, the Messenians, reduced to a condition of collective servitude, who outnumbered the Spartan citizen population by a ratio that ancient sources estimated at somewhere between 7 and 20 to 1. Managing that imbalance would define Spartan society for the next 300 years. The people the Spartans called helots were not slaves in the Roman sense. They were not individually owned, could not be sold, and were tied to the land rather than to a particular master. But they were bound to work the agricultural estates of Spartan citizens, required to hand over a fixed portion of their produce, and denied any meaningful political or legal standing. They could be killed by Spartan citizens under certain circumstances with no legal consequence. They were, in effect, a permanently subjugated class, whose labour underwrote the entire Spartan system, freeing male citizens from the need to farm, trade, or engage in any manual craft, and allowing them to devote the whole of their adult lives to military training. The system the Spartans built around this reality was called the Lycurgan Constitution, attributed by tradition to a lawgiver named Lycurgus, though whether Lycurgus was a historical individual, a composite figure, or a useful fiction, is a question that Greek historians were already debating in antiquity. What is clear is that by roughly 650 BC, the main institutions of the classical Spartan system were in place. Male Spartan citizens began their formal education at the age of 7, when they were taken from their families and enrolled in the agoge, a state-run system of communal upbringing that continued until the age of 30. The agoge was not principally about book learning. It was about endurance, physical toughening, group loyalty, and the suppression of individual preference in favour of collective discipline. Boys were housed in barracks, fed deliberately sparse rations partly to toughen them, and partly, the theory went, to encourage the practical skill of foraging and obtaining food without detection, and subjected to a regime of physical training, competition, and instruction in the arts of war. The famous Spartan black broth, a thick stew made of pork cooked in blood and seasoned with salt and vinegar, was reportedly so unpalatable that a visitor from another city who tried it at a communal Spartan meal remarked that he now understood completely why Spartans did not fear death. The Spartans, who found this observation neither amusing nor inaccurate, continued eating it anyway. At the age of 18, Spartan youths moved into a more intensive military phase, living and training in organised units. At 20, they became full soldiers. At 30, they were permitted to live with their families, though they still ate in communal messes called syssitia with their military unit, contributing food from their own estates. Full political standing as a Spartan citizen, a Spartiate, or in their own terminology, one of the homoioi, meaning the equals required maintaining that mess contribution. A Spartan who could not keep up the payments lost his citizen status. The equality suggested by the word homoioi was always conditional. The government of Sparta was unusual by any Greek standard. It had 2 kings simultaneously, drawn from 2 hereditary royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. The dual kingship was not the result of some ancient compromise that everyone had forgotten the reasons for, though it may have begun that way. In practice, it served as a check on royal power, since the 2 kings could monitor and constrain each other, and neither could become dangerously dominant without the other's cooperation. The kings commanded the army in the field, performed religious functions, and held considerable prestige, but their actual authority was limited by 2 other bodies. The Gerousia was a council of 28 men over the age of 60, elected for life, plus the 2 kings. It prepared legislation and functioned as a high court for serious cases. The 5 ephors magistrates elected annually by the Spartan Citizen Assembly held sweeping supervisory authority, could summon and interrogate the kings, and generally served as a counterweight to both royal and aristocratic power. The assembly itself, called the Apella, consisted of all adult male Spartan citizens and voted on major questions, though its role was primarily to approve or reject proposals from the Gerousia, rather than to debate and originate them. Spartan women occupied a genuinely different position from women in most other Greek poleis. They were not expected to be confined to the household in the way that Athenian women were. They exercised publicly, competed in athletic events, managed estates in the extended absences of their husbands, received an education, and spoke their minds. The directness of Spartan women was remarked upon, sometimes admiringly and sometimes with discomfort, by observers from other Greek cities. The reasoning behind this relative freedom was entirely practical from the Spartan perspective. Women who were healthy, educated, and confident produced better soldiers. Sentiment had nothing to do with it. The darker underside of the Spartan system was something the Spartans themselves did not advertise widely, though it was known, in outline at least, to other Greeks. It was an institution called the Crypteia, and it was the mechanism by which the Helot population was kept in a state of perpetual controlled fear. Each year, the ephors would formally declare war on the Helots, a ritual legal declaration that freed any Spartan citizen from the normal religious prohibitions against killing. Selected young Spartan men, near the end of their agoge training, were then sent out into the countryside, armed with daggers, for a period of covert operation. They moved by night, hid by day, and killed helots, preferring those who appeared physically strong or who showed signs of independent spirit. It was part intelligence operation, part military exercise, and part systematic terrorism. Any helot who seemed capable of organising resistance was to be removed before the threat became real. The krypteia meant that the Spartan military system was not simply about external warfare. It was, at its foundation, a mechanism for managing an internal population that was both economically essential and politically explosive. The Spartans were not unique in the ancient world in holding a subjugated agricultural population, but no other Greek city-state organised its entire society so explicitly and completely around the task of keeping that population in check, while simultaneously maintaining military superiority over its neighbours. Other Greeks admired Sparta selectively and at a safe distance. Athenian intellectuals and politicians who found their own democracy noisy, chaotic, and frustrating sometimes pointed to Sparta as a model of stability and discipline. The philosopher Plato drew on Spartan ideas in his theoretical descriptions of an ideal state, but very few of the people who admired Sparta's order and discipline actually wanted to live the life it required. The Spartan system produced extraordinary soldiers. It also produced a society in which no individual was permitted to accumulate personal wealth beyond a modest level, in which artistic and intellectual achievement were treated as distractions from the real business of military readiness, in which boys were separated from their parents at 7, and in which the entire collective enterprise rested on the labour of a population held in systematic subjugation. The price of Spartan excellence was paid by everyone inside Sparta, citizen and helot alike, just in very different currencies. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, Sparta had become the dominant military power in the Peloponnese, its leadership acknowledged through a network of alliances known collectively as the Peloponnesian League. It was powerful, respected, and genuinely feared. But while Sparta had been perfecting the art of the controlled society, another city was moving in a different direction, entirely arriving, through argument and conflict and reform, at something far more complicated and considerably louder. Athens and the birth of democracy. Athens in the early 6th century BC was a city in the process of tearing itself apart, and the tearing turned out to be productive. The underlying problem was debt. Across the region of Attica, small farmers had been borrowing against the security of their land and, in some cases, their own persons. When harvests failed or prices moved against them, they could not repay. Under the prevailing Athenian legal arrangements, a creditor could seize not only the land of a defaulting debtor, but the debtor himself and his family, reducing free citizens to a condition of debt bondage. By around 600 BC, a significant portion of Attica's farming population was either landless, deeply indebted, or effectively enslaved to wealthy creditors. The aristocratic families who dominated Athenian politics, controlling the archonship, the Areopagus, and the courts were, in many cases, precisely the creditors to whom the indebted farmers owed money. The tension produced by this arrangement had been building for years. Other Greek cities facing similar pressures had sometimes resolved them through tyranny. A strongman who seized power, cancelled debts, redistributed land, and secured the loyalty of the non-aristocratic population. Athens, in 694 BC, nearly went that route when a man named Cylon attempted to seize the Acropolis with the backing of his father-in-law, the tyrant of Megara. The attempt failed, and the aristocratic clan that suppressed it, the Alcmaeonidae, acquired a lasting religious taint from the circumstances of the aftermath. The taint would be used against them politically for generations, which tells you something about the long memories of Athenian political life. The figure Athens turned to instead was Solon, appointed in 594 BC as chief archon, with extraordinary powers to reform the city's legal and economic arrangements. Solon was a merchant, a poet, and a man with a practical understanding of what happened to societies that allowed their internal inequalities to become irresolvable. He did not approach the crisis as an idealist. He approached it as someone trying to prevent a collapse. His first and most immediate measure was the Sysakthia, the shaking off of burdens. All debts secured against the freedom of Athenian citizens were cancelled. Athenians who had been enslaved for debt were freed. Land that had been forfeited was, in at least some categories, returned. The stone markers that had been placed on indebted land to signal its encumbrance were removed. This measure relieved the immediate crisis and permanently eliminated debt slavery as a legal institution in Attica, which was a more lasting achievement than it might initially appear. Solon then restructured the Athenian political system along lines that divided citizens into 4 classes based not on birth but on annual agricultural income measured in medimnoi, units of grain production. The highest class, the pentakosio medimnoi, were those whose estates produced 500 or more medimnoi per year. Below them, in descending order of income, came the hippes, the zergitai, and finally the thetes, the landless labourers at the bottom. Political offices and responsibilities were distributed according to these classes. The highest offices remained restricted to the top tier. Military obligations were calibrated to income, and the thetes, though excluded from most offices, were admitted to the assembly and to the popular courts. This was not democracy. It was a careful recalibration of aristocratic privilege, opening political participation to a broader propertied class while maintaining meaningful distinctions between income levels. But it established a principle that political standing should reflect economic contribution rather than birth alone that would prove consequential. Solon left Athens after his reforms, reportedly to prevent any faction from pressuring him to revise them in their favour. He travelled for 10 years. Athens promptly descended back into factional conflict, and within a generation the city had acquired the tyrant it had previously avoided. Pisistratos, a populist aristocrat from the coastal faction of Athenian politics, seized power 3 times, the first 2 times being expelled before establishing himself firmly in around 546 BC. His tyranny lasted until his death in 527 BC, and then continued, with less success, under his sons. The rule of the Pisistratidae, the family of Pisistratos, was not, by the standards of ancient tyranny, especially oppressive. They maintained the forms of Solon's constitution while ensuring their own people held the key positions. They promoted public building in Athens, patronized the arts, and oversaw the establishment of the great Panathenaic festival and the official compilation of the Homeric poems in Athens. But tyranny was tyranny, and the aristocratic families displaced from their traditional dominance eventually found their opportunity. In 510 BC, with assistance from a Spartan army, Sparta had developed a principled if self-serving opposition to tyrannies. The Pisistratidae were expelled. What followed was a period of sharp aristocratic competition to control the newly opened political landscape, and it was out of that competition that one of the most consequential political reforms in human history emerged. Cleisthenes, a member of the Alcmaeonidae clan, proposed his reforms in 508 and 507 BC, after losing a power struggle with a rival aristocrat and making an unusual decision. He took his case directly to the people. What he offered them, and what they accepted, was a fundamental reorganization of the Athenian political community. Cleisthenes abolished the 4 traditional Ionian tribes that had structured Athenian political and military life, replacing them with 10 new artificial tribes. Each new tribe drew its members from 3 different geographical zones of Attica, the city, the coastal area, and the inland region, so that no tribe represented a single locality or could be dominated by a single powerful family's regional network. Each tribe contributed 50 members to a new council of 500. The boule, which prepared business for the citizen assembly, the ecclesia, and handled the day-to-day administration of the city. The ecclesia met regularly on the Pnyx Hill, a natural auditorium west of the Acropolis, and all adult male Athenian citizens were entitled to attend, to speak, and to vote. Not just the wealthy, not just the well-born, but any free adult male citizen of Athens. The assembly decided on war and peace, approved laws, elected generals, and managed the broad direction of city policy. It was loud, it was contentious, it was manipulable by skilled speakers, and it was unlike anything that had existed before in a major political community. Cleisthenes also introduced a measure so beautifully impractical that it could only have been invented by a society with genuine faith in collective civic judgment. Each year, the assembly could vote to ostracize a citizen to send him into exile for 10 years without loss of property or citizen rights, simply on the grounds that enough people felt he was becoming dangerously powerful. The vote was conducted by having citizens scratch the name of their chosen candidate onto a pottery shard, an ostrakon, and the person receiving the most votes, provided the total exceeded 6,000, was sent away. Archaeologists excavating the Athenian agora found batches of ostraka with Themistocles' name inscribed on them, hundreds of them, apparently written by only a handful of different hands, clearly prepared in advance for distribution to voters who had not quite managed to do their own writing. Someone, it appears, was running an organised campaign to have Themistocles exiled, complete with pre-filled ballot papers. Democracy was barely a generation old, and the business of gaming it had already begun. The Athenian democracy that emerged from Cleisthenes' reforms was not, by modern standards, a complete one. Women were excluded from political life entirely. The large slave population of Attica had no standing whatsoever. Resident foreigners metics, who might live their entire lives in Athens, pay taxes, and even serve in the military, could not become citizens. The democracy was a democracy of a particular subset of the population, and it was comfortable with that limitation in ways that require some historical distance to fully understand. But within the community it included, it was genuinely participatory in a way that distinguished Athens sharply from virtually every other political community of its time. Ordinary citizens, farmers, craftsmen, traders sat in the assembly and voted on matters of war and law. They served on juries of hundreds of their peers. They held administrative offices selected by lot. The assumption built into the system was that an ordinary Athenian was capable of understanding civic affairs and making reasonable judgments about them. That assumption was radical. It remained radical for a very long time. Athens, in 500 BC, was a city of perhaps 200,000 people in total. Citizens, women, children, metics, and slaves combined with a citizen body of perhaps 30 to 40,000 adult males. It was not yet the intellectual and cultural centre it would become. Its great buildings were still in the future. Its most famous philosophers had not yet been born, but it had built, through argument and crisis, and the occasional expulsion of unwanted persons, a political framework that would define it for the next 150 years, and that would eventually define something rather larger. First, though, Athens had to survive. Fire from the east. The Persian Wars. The Persian Empire at the end of the 6th century BC was the largest political entity the world had yet seen. Stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia in the west to the borders of India in the east, from Egypt in the south to the steppes beyond the Caucasus in the north, it encompassed dozens of languages, hundreds of distinct peoples, and an administrative system sophisticated enough to manage them all. Its king, who bore the title King of Kings, ruled from palace complexes at Persepolis and Susa that made the grandest Greek temple look modest by comparison. The Persian state had resources, manpower, and organizational capacity on a scale that no Greek city-state or any combination of them could match. The collision between this empire and the Greek world began not with Persian aggression toward mainland Greece, but with a revolt among the Greek-speaking cities of Ionia, the western coast of Anatolia, that had been under Persian control since the conquests of Cyrus the Great in the 540s BC. The Ionian cities were prosperous, culturally active, and politically restless. Persian governance was not, by ancient imperial standards, especially harsh subject. Peoples were generally permitted their own customs, languages, and religious practices as long as they paid their tribute and provided troops. But the Ionians, accustomed to the political independence of the polis, found the experience of being administered as a satrapy, a Persian provincial district, increasingly uncomfortable. In 499 BC, a group of Ionian cities rose in revolt against Persian authority, led in part by the city of Miletus and its political leader Aristagoras. Aristagoras travelled to mainland Greece seeking military support. Sparta, the most powerful military force in Greece, declined. The distance was too great, the commitment too open-ended. Athens, perhaps moved by solidarity with Ionian Greeks who shared cultural ties with Attica, sent 20 ships. Eretria, on the island of Euboea, sent 5. It was not a large commitment, but it was enough to make both cities directly complicit in what followed. In 498 BC, the Ionian forces, with their Athenian and Eretrian allies, marched on Sardis, the capital of the Persian satrapy, and a city of considerable symbolic importance, and burned it. The Persian garrison withdrew to the citadel, and the city was largely destroyed, including a temple sacred to a local goddess. The burning of Sardis was subsequently used by the Persians as the formal justification for punitive action against those who had participated, and the names Athens and Eretria were noted accordingly. The Ionian revolt failed by 494 BC. The Persian fleet defeated the combined Ionian fleet at the Battle of Lade. Miletus was captured and its population scattered, and Persian control over the Aegean coast of Anatolia was reasserted. What remained were those noted names. Darius, king of Persia, reportedly instructed a servant to remind him 3 times at every dinner to remember the Athenians. Whether this particular story is true or simply a good story is uncertain, but the Persian response was real enough. A first Persian expedition against Greece in 492 BC was led by Mardonius, Darius's son-in-law, and reached as far as the coast of Macedonia before a storm destroyed a significant portion of the fleet near the promontory of Mount Athos. The expedition withdrew. A second attempt 2 years later, in 490 BC, was a more direct naval assault. A Persian fleet under the commanders Datis and Artaphernes crossed the Aegean, subdued several island communities, destroyed Eretria in repayment for its role in the Ionian revolt, and landed its forces on the plain of Marathon, on the northeastern coast of Attica, roughly 25 miles from Athens. The Athenian response was to march their army to Marathon rather than wait behind the city's walls. The Athenian force, commanded by a board of 10 generals with a senior military official named Miltiades as the principal strategic voice, faced a Persian army that was substantially larger. Ancient sources give numbers for Persian forces that modern historians treat with considerable skepticism, but the Persian army was almost certainly larger, and it included cavalry that the Athenians did not have in equivalent numbers. Miltiades' solution was to thin the Athenian centre and strengthen the wings, then advance at a run, moving quickly enough to close the distance before Persian archers could thin the approaching lines at leisure. The wings enveloped the Persian centre, the Persians broke and retreated to their ships, and the Athenians had won a battle that had no logical reason to go in their favour. The Persians re-embarked and sailed around the Attic peninsula toward Athens, presumably hoping to find the city undefended while the army was still at Marathon. The Athenian army marched back to Athens fast enough to be in position when the Persian fleet arrived. The Persians assessed the situation and withdrew. The Athenian victory at Marathon in 490 BC was militarily significant and psychologically enormous. It demonstrated that a Greek hoplite army could defeat a Persian force in open battle, and it gave Athens in particular a confidence and a sense of destiny that would shape its political culture for a generation. Darius died in 486 BC, before he could mount the larger response he had been preparing. His son Xerxes completed the preparations and led the campaign himself, personally commanding an expedition that was organized on a scale well beyond anything the previous Persian campaigns had attempted. Ancient sources give the Persian army sizes that cannot be taken literally. Herodotus, who wrote the most detailed account, offers numbers in the millions, but even sober modern estimates place the Persian force at well over 100,000 soldiers, supported by a fleet of perhaps 800 warships. It was, by any measure, a formidable undertaking. Xerxes had 2 bridges of boats constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Anatolia and Europe, to move his army into Europe. When a storm destroyed the first set of bridges before the army could cross, Xerxes ordered the strait itself to be punished. 300 lashes were administered to the water, and a pair of fetters were thrown in for good measure. The engineers who had built the first bridges were executed. New bridges were constructed and the army crossed. The Hellespont, presumably chastened, offered no further resistance. The Greeks who decided to resist, and not all of them did, a significant number of northern Greek cities medized, meaning they submitted to Persia and provided support for the invasion, organised their defence under Spartan leadership. A force was sent to hold the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae in central Greece, while the combined Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy nearby at Artemisium. The Spartan king Leonidas held Thermopylae for 3 days with a force that ancient tradition records at 300 Spartans, alongside several thousand allied troops from other Greek cities. The Persian force was eventually able to outflank the Greek position through a mountain path shown to them by a local man named Ephialtes. When the flanking movement was confirmed, Leonidas sent most of the allied forces away and remained with the Spartans and a contingent of Thespians and Thebans to hold the pass long enough for the retreat to be organised. The Spartan dead were buried where they fell, and a stone marker was placed above them with an inscription that the Spartan poet Simonides composed, that the passerby should know that here, obedient to their laws, they lay. Athens was evacuated. The Persian army arrived and burned the city. The Acropolis, which a small group had held, was taken and its buildings destroyed. The decisive engagement came at sea, in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Athenian mainland, in late September of 480 BC. The Athenian commander Themistocles, who had spent the previous decade convincing Athens to invest its silver mine revenues in a fleet of 200 trireme warships, manoeuvred the Persian fleet into the narrow waters where its numerical superiority was negated, and where the heavier, better crewed Greek ships could operate effectively. The Persian fleet suffered heavy losses and withdrew. Without reliable naval supply lines, a large land army could not sustain itself indefinitely in a hostile country, and Xerxes returned to Persia with a significant portion of his forces. The remaining Persian army, under Mardonius, was defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, where a large Greek coalition force, this time under Spartan command, destroyed the last major Persian presence in mainland Greece. On the same day, by the tradition preserved in ancient sources, the Greek fleet defeated the remaining Persian naval force at Cape Michael on the Ionian coast. The Persian wars were over, and Greece had survived them. What happened to Greece in the years immediately following was, in many respects, shaped entirely by the fact of that survival, and by the very different conclusions that Athens and Sparta drew from it. The Golden Age, Athens at its height. Victory over Persia did not produce humility in Athens. It produced ambition, and Athens pursued that ambition with a focus and energy that transformed it, within a generation, from a significant Greek city into something rather closer to an empire. The mechanism was the Delian League. In the years immediately following the Persian Wars, a coalition of Greek city-states organised under Athenian leadership to continue operations against Persia, protecting the Ionian cities, clearing Persian forces from remaining Aegean positions, and maintaining a naval force capable of deterring future Persian incursions. Member states contributed either ships or money, with money being, in practice, the preferred contribution since ships required trained crews and regular maintenance. The League's common treasury was kept on the sacred island of Delos, which gave the organisation its name. Over the course of the following decades, the League gradually transformed. In 454 BC, the treasury was moved from Delos to Athens officially for security reasons, though security was a flexible concept when applied to funds already located on a major island, protected by the most powerful navy in the Aegean. Member states that fell behind in their contributions found Athenian warships appearing in their harbours. States that attempted to leave the League found that leaving was not an available option. By the middle of the 5th century BC, the Delian League had become, in practical terms, an Athenian empire, one that Athens administered, taxed, and directed according to its own interests, while maintaining the vocabulary of voluntary alliance. The leader most closely identified with this period was Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics from around 460 BC until his death in 429 BC. Pericles was an aristocrat by birth, a member of the Alcmaeonidae on his mother's side, who had committed himself to the democratic faction in Athenian politics and built a career through the assembly rather than through the aristocratic networks his family background might have supported. He was a careful speaker rather than a spectacular one, known for precision and clarity rather than rhetorical fireworks, and he combined an unusual ability to communicate complex strategic thinking to a mass audience with the political skill to maintain majority support in an assembly that was perfectly capable of changing its mind. The revenue flowing into Athens from the tribute of allied states gave Pericles the resources to pursue a program of public building on a scale that the city had never before attempted. Athens had been burned by the Persians in 480 BC, and the Acropolis, the rocky hill above the city that held its most sacred temples, had been left in deliberate ruins for a generation, as a visible reminder of what Persia had done and why the war continued. When a peace with Persia was finally concluded around 449 BC, the justification for that memorial policy expired, and Pericles moved quickly. The Parthenon was begun in 447 BC and completed in 432 BC. It was a temple to Athena, the city's patron deity, built entirely of white marble from the nearby Mount Pentelicus, designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates under the overall artistic direction of the sculptor Phidias. The building was technically innovative in ways that are not immediately obvious to the eye. Its columns are not perfectly straight, but curve very slightly outward. Its floor is not perfectly flat, but curves very slightly upward at the centre, and the columns lean inward at an angle so slight as to be invisible individually, but mathematically precise. These adjustments were made to correct for the optical distortions that perfectly straight geometry would create at that scale. The resulting building looks, to the human eye, more regular than a mathematically regular building would. Inside stood a statue of Athena, created by Phidias, roughly 12 meters tall, constructed over a wooden framework and covered in ivory and gold. The gold alone, carefully recorded, weighed approximately 44 talents. Pericles' political opponents raised the entirely reasonable objection that using allied tribute funds, money contributed for the purpose of collective defense against Persia, to build gold-plated statues and marble. Temples for the glorification of Athens was not, strictly speaking, what the contributing states had agreed to. Pericles responded, with admirable directness, that as long as Athens provided the defence it had promised, the Allies had no particular claim on how Athens spent what remained. The assembly, surrounded by the evidence of what that spending was producing, found this argument persuasive. The Acropolis building programme continued beyond the Parthenon. The Propylaea, an elaborate gateway complex marking the entrance to the sacred precinct, was begun in 437 BC. The small but exquisite temple of Athena Nike was added shortly after. The Erechtheion, with its famous porch of 6 female figures serving as columns, was completed before the end of the century. The effect of the whole ensemble, seen from the city below or from the surrounding plain, was of a hillside entirely transformed into an architectural statement about the wealth, piety, and ambition of the city that had built it. The Athens of the 5th century BC supported, and in many cases actively sponsored, an intellectual and artistic culture of extraordinary range. The theatre festivals held in honour of Dionysus were civic events, funded by wealthy citizens assigned the responsibility of paying for chorus training and costumes as a form of public service. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon and lived to write plays about the moral consequences of the Persian Wars, produced the Oresteia trilogy in 458 BC, a connected sequence of 3 plays tracing the logic of inherited violence and its resolution through law. Sophocles, who served as a general under Pericles as well as writing drama, gave Athens Oedipus, Rex, and Antigone. Euripides, the youngest of the 3 great tragedians, pushed the form toward psychological realism in ways that made audiences deeply uncomfortable and made him, consequently, enormously influential. Comedy had its own great practitioner in Aristophanes, who wrote plays that lampooned prominent politicians, made jokes about the ongoing Peloponnesian War to audiences who were suffering through it, and demonstrated that Athenian democracy's tolerance for public criticism extended further than most governments then or since have been willing to go. The writing of history as a disciplined inquiry into past events based on evidence and critical reasoning, rather than as mythology or royal chronicle, emerged in this period almost simultaneously from 2 figures shaped by the Athenian world. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who spent significant time in Athens, produced an account of the Persian Wars that ranged so widely across the geography and customs of the known world that his detractors called him a fabulist and his admirers called him the father of history. Thucydides, an Athenian general who was exiled for a military failure in 424 BC and used his years of exile to interview participants and study the conflict he had lived through, produced an account of the Peloponnesian War that reads, even today, as a masterclass in analytical historical writing. Walking in the Agora, the open civic and commercial space at the heart of Athens during this period, a citizen might encounter Socrates conducting one of the extended questioning conversations through which he claimed to be pursuing wisdom rather than teaching it. Socrates wrote nothing. What he did was talk relentlessly, precisely, with a talent for leading educated and confident men to discover that their firmly held beliefs did not survive careful examination. He made enemies with efficiency. He also made disciples, among them Plato, whose written dialogues preserve the Socratic method and extend it into questions about justice, beauty, knowledge, and the nature of the good life that philosophy has been reworking ever since. The Athens of Pericles was, by any measure, an exceptional place and an exceptional moment. It was also a city built on slave labour. Estimates suggest that roughly 1/3 of the total population of Attica may have been enslaved, and on the economic exploitation of subordinate allies who had not freely chosen their subordination. The women of Athens, unlike their counterparts in Sparta, were largely confined to the domestic sphere, excluded from the political and intellectual life that made the city famous. The freedom that Pericles celebrated in the funeral oration recorded by Thucydides was the freedom of a specific class of Athenian men, enjoyed at the considerable expense of everyone else in the social order. This did not make the intellectual and cultural achievements less real. It did mean they rested on foundations that the city had never examined with the same rigour it applied to philosophy and drama and the geometry of temple columns. By the 430s BC, the tension between Athens and Sparta, both strengthened by the Persian War experience, both operating within a Greek world too small for 2 powers of their ambition, had reached a point that most informed observers could see was not sustainable. The golden age of Athens was approximately 30 years old. It had roughly 2 years left. How Greeks actually lived. History tends to record the exceptional, the battles, the reforms, the famous speeches, and leave the texture of ordinary daily existence as background noise. But the city that produced the Parthenon and the plays of Sophocles was also a city where most people woke before dawn, ate plain food, worked with their hands, and went to bed when it got dark because oil lamps were expensive and sleep was free. Both things were true at the same time, and the second is just as worth understanding as the first. The physical shape of a classical Greek city was organized around a few key spaces. The agora, the central open area that served simultaneously as marketplace, civic meeting ground, and social hub, was where much of daily life played out for the male citizen population. Surrounding it were the workshops of craftsmen, the stalls of small traders, the public buildings where magistrates conducted business, and the covered walkways called stoas, where men gathered to talk, argue, conduct transactions, and watch other people do the same. The Acropolis rose above the city as its sacred precinct. The harbour, in Athens' case at Piraeus, several miles from the city centre, was the economic engine that kept the whole enterprise running. Houses across the classical Greek world were, by the standards of the public buildings being constructed at the same time, modest. They were typically built around a central courtyard, with rooms opening off it, constructed from mud brick on stone foundations with tiled roofs. They were designed for function rather than display the private face of Greek culture deliberately understated compared to its public one. Walls were plastered and sometimes painted, floors were packed earth or simple mosaic in wealthier homes, and furniture was limited to beds, wooden chests, chairs, and the occasional low table. The courtyard was the working heart of the house, where food preparation happened, where women spent much of their time, and where the household altar to the domestic gods stood. The social hierarchy of classical Athens divided people into several distinct categories with very different daily experiences. At the top sat the citizens, free adult males of Athenian birth. Among citizens, wealth created further distinctions. The wealthiest families, those with sufficient property to qualify for the highest Solonian class, lived in larger homes, owned more slaves, sent their sons to private teachers, and participated in the expensive civic obligations that Athenian democracy distributed to those who could afford them. Fitting out a warship for a year, sponsoring a tragic chorus at the theatre festival, or training athletes for the games at one's own expense, were forms of what the Athenians called liturgy, public service, funded by private wealth. They were technically voluntary, practically expected, and socially impossible to refuse without damage to one's reputation. Below the wealthiest tier sat the broad middle band of citizen farmers and craftsmen who made up the core of the Athenian assembly. A farm of moderate size in Attica might produce enough olives, grain, and grapes to sustain a family with a small surplus for the market. Life at this level was comfortable by ancient standards, but not leisurely. A farmer's day was governed by the agricultural calendar, ploughing and planting in autumn, tending and harvesting through spring and summer, pressing olives and grapes at the appropriate seasons, and by the animals and equipment that required constant attention regardless of season. The food ordinary Athenians ate was simple and consistent. Bread made from barley was the staple, supplemented by olives and olive oil, dried figs, and whatever vegetables the garden produced: onions, lentils, chickpeas, garlic. Fish was the primary protein for most people, since it was more affordable than meat from cattle or pigs, which were typically slaughtered and eaten communally at religious festivals, rather than as regular meals. Wine was consumed daily, but almost always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered a sign of poor character rather than serious drinking, which was a distinction the Greeks found important. Honey served as the primary sweetener. Cheese, eggs, and dried legumes rounded out the diet of a household that was eating adequately but not extravagantly. Clothing in the classical period was straightforward in construction and limited in variety. The basic garment for both men and women was the chiton, a rectangle of woven wool or linen, fastened at the shoulders and belted at the waist, falling to the knee for men and to the ankle for women. Over this, both men and women might wear a himation, a larger rectangle of fabric draped around the body in a manner that required some practice to manage elegantly, and that ancient vase paintings suggest was not always managed that way. Women's dress also included the peplos, an earlier style that pinned differently at the shoulders and created a characteristic folded overfold at the chest. Colours were available. Dyes made from minerals, plants, and marine organisms could produce reds, yellows, and the extraordinarily expensive purple derived from murex sea snails that signalled wealth and high status, but undyed or naturally coloured wool was what most people wore most of the time. Footwear was sandals, worn outdoors and left at the door when entering a house. Going barefoot in the city was common and carried no particular social stigma, though Socrates' habit of going everywhere barefoot regardless of season was noted by contemporaries as one of several eccentricities that set him apart from the general population. Below the citizen class sat the metics free non-citizens, many of them Greeks from other polis, who lived and worked in Athens under legal protections but without political rights. Metics paid their own tax, served in the military when required, and were in many cases essential contributors to Athenian economic life. Craftsmen, traders, teachers and doctors were frequently metics. They could own property, operate businesses, and participate in the religious life of the city, but they could not vote, hold office, or own land in Attica. The philosopher Aristotle, who spent most of his adult life in Athens, was a metic Macedonian by birth, brilliant by reputation, and constitutionally barred from the assembly that governed the city where he lived and worked. At the base of the social structure sat the enslaved population, whose labour underpinned the Athenian economy in ways that the celebrated political culture above them rarely acknowledged directly. Enslaved people in Athens performed an enormous range of tasks: domestic work in households, skilled craft labour in workshops, mining in the silver mines at Laurium, under conditions that ancient sources describe as among the most brutal in the Greek world, agricultural labour on farms, and administrative work in the city's bureaucracy. Some enslaved people were trained as clerks and records keepers, serving the public offices of the democracy. The conditions of enslaved life varied enormously, depending on the work and the household, from the relatively bearable to the genuinely terrible, but no legal protection or political standing softened the fundamental reality of the condition. Women of citizen families occupied a domestic world that was physically separate from the public sphere in which Athenian civic life played out. A citizen woman managed the household, overseeing food storage and preparation, supervising enslaved domestic workers, raising children, and producing textiles. Weaving was both an economic activity and a marker of respectable feminine virtue. Women moved through the city for religious festivals, funerals, and certain social occasions, but the expectation that a respectable woman's life was centred on the household was both a legal and a social reality. The women who had the most visible public presence in classical Athens were not citizens but hetero-educated, independent women who occupied an ambiguous status outside the citizen household structure, some of whom moved in the same intellectual circles as the city's most prominent men. The day in Athens began early. The agora filled with traders and buyers from shortly after dawn. Men conducted their business, legal, commercial, political, through the morning hours. The main meal of the day was taken in the early afternoon, followed by a rest during the hottest part of the day. Evening brought the institution of the symposium for those who could afford to participate, a formal drinking party held in the male dining room of a house, where guests reclined on couches, drank wine in measured rounds from a shared mixing bowl, and engaged in the competitive performance of singing, recitation, debate, and increasingly elaborate wordplay that was one of the primary forms of elite male socializing. Symposia could be intellectually serious or merely entertaining, and surviving accounts suggest they were frequently both simultaneously. The gods were present throughout all of this in ways that were practical rather than merely ceremonial. Every significant action, a journey, a business transaction, a marriage, a military campaign, was preceded by some form of religious acknowledgement. The household maintained its own small shrines. The city maintained its great temples. The boundary between religious observance and daily routine was not clearly drawn, because in the classical Greek understanding, the gods were not remote figures concerned only with grand affairs. They were interested in everything, and it was sensible to keep them informed and reasonably satisfied. It was a world that worked hard, ate simply, dressed plainly, argued constantly, and believed that how a citizen conducted his public life mattered as much as anything else he might do. The philosophy and the drama and the architecture were not separate from ordinary life. They grew directly out of it. Greeks against Greeks, the Peloponnesian War, the war that broke out in 431 BC between Athens and Sparta, had been building for at least a generation, and the stated causes a dispute over the city of Epidamnus, a quarrel about Megara's trading rights, a naval confrontation near the island of Corcyra were, as Thucydides observed in the opening pages of his history, not the real cause at all. The real cause, he wrote, was the growth of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Sparta. Everything else was occasion rather than origin. The fear was reasonable. In the 50 years since the Persian Wars, Athens had converted a voluntary defensive alliance into a tribute-collecting empire, built the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean, constructed the long walls that connected the city to its port at Piraeus, and made it effectively impregnable to land attack, and accumulated a substantial financial reserve in silver stored on the Acropolis. Sparta watched this accumulation with the particular anxiety of a power that had built its security on land supremacy and now found itself facing a rival that operated in an entirely different strategic environment. Two systems of power had developed that were not easily compatible in the same world. The opening strategy on each side reflected the structural reality. Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies invaded Attica annually, burning crops and farmland. Athens refused to meet them in open land battle, which would have been to fight on Spartan terms, and instead relied on its walls, its fleet, and its ability to conduct coastal raids around the Peloponnese. The Athenian rural population, following Pericles' strategy, moved inside the walls of Athens and Piraeus, leaving the farmland to the Spartans while the navy maintained the empire's tribute income. The strategy was sound. Its consequences were not foreseeable. In 430 BC, during the second Spartan invasion of Attica, a plague entered Athens through its port. Modern analysis of the ancient description suggests something in the vicinity of typhoid fever, combined with a toxic shock complication, though the exact disease remains debated. What is not debated is the scale of destruction. Athens, its rural population crowded behind its walls in conditions that could not have been designed better for the spread of infectious disease, lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its total population over the following 3 to 4 years. Pericles himself died of it in 429 BC, leaving the Athenian political scene without the figure who had shaped it for 30 years. The plague did not end the war. Athens had the financial reserves and the institutional momentum to continue, but it removed Pericles' restraining strategic hand from a democracy that was now susceptible to less patient voices. The decade that followed what later historians call the Archidamian War after the Spartan king. Archidamus, who had led the early invasions, produced military stalemate punctuated by small tactical victories on each side. The Athenian general and Tanna's son Cleon pushed for a more aggressive Athenian strategy and achieved a notable success at Pylos in 425 BC, capturing over 120 Spartan soldiers alive, including a number of full Spartiates whose survival mattered to Sparta in ways the numbers alone do not convey, since Sparta's citizen population had been declining for generations. On the other side, the Spartan commander Brasidas conducted a brilliant northern campaign, detaching important Athenian tribute-paying cities from the alliance through a combination of military pressure and unexpectedly generous political terms. Cleon and Brasidas both died at Amphipolis in 422 BC in the same engagement, which was the kind of coincidence that ancient writers treated as meaningful and modern historians treat as convenient. Their deaths removed the two figures most committed to continued fighting, and a peace treaty, the Peace of Nicias, named for its Athenian negotiator, was concluded in 421 BC. It was supposed to last 50 years. It lasted about 6. The figure who did the most to undermine it was Alcibiades, a young Athenian aristocrat of extraordinary personal gifts and almost complete political reliability in the negative direction. Beautiful, wealthy, brilliantly intelligent, and possessed of an ambition that no available theatre was quite large enough to satisfy, he had grown up as a ward of Pericles and had absorbed the Periclean vision of Athens as an empire capable of indefinite expansion. In 415 BC, he persuaded the Athenian assembly to approve the largest military expedition the city had ever attempted, an invasion of Sicily, aimed at bringing the wealthy island communities of the western Mediterranean under Athenian control. The assembly voted for this with considerable enthusiasm. Thucydides noted, with characteristic precision, that most Athenians who voted had only the vaguest idea of where Sicily was or how large it was, and that those who did know were not volunteering the information. The Sicilian expedition was a catastrophe of a scale that redefined what catastrophe meant in a Greek context. The expedition's joint command was fractured from the start when Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face religious charges connected to the mutilation of the city's Hermes statues. On the night before departure, an act of sacrilege, whose perpetrators were unknown, but whose political usefulness against Alcibiades was immediately apparent to his enemies. Rather than return to face a trial he correctly assessed as likely to end in his death, Alcibiades sailed instead to Sparta and offered his services and detailed knowledge of Athenian plans to the enemy. Left under weaker command, the Athenian force in Sicily was besieged inside its own siege lines around Syracuse. The Athenians sent reinforcements. The reinforcements were also trapped. In 413 BC, after 2 years of progressively deteriorating position, the entire Athenian force attempted to retreat overland. The Syracusans and their Spartan advisors pursued them, caught them, and destroyed what remained. The Athenian dead and captured numbered in the tens of thousands. The fleet of 200 ships was gone. The financial reserves accumulated over decades were largely spent. Athens rebuilt with a resilience that surprised everyone, including Sparta. The city continued fighting for another 9 years, winning significant naval engagements and losing others, navigating a political crisis that briefly replaced the democracy with an oligarchic council of 400 before the democratic institutions reasserted themselves. Alcibiades, characteristically, changed sides again and then again, before being eventually removed from Athenian command after one of his subordinates lost a battle he had specifically been ordered not to fight. The war's final phase turned on Persian money. Sparta, after decades of insisting that the war was about liberating Greeks from Athenian tyranny, accepted a Persian subsidy in exchange for acknowledging Persian sovereignty over the Ionian Greek cities, which was, diplomatically, a spectacular reversal of everything the Persian wars had supposedly established, achieved without apparent irony. The Persian money financed a Spartan fleet under the admiral Lysander who, in 405 BC, destroyed the last significant Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in the Hellespont by the straightforward method of attacking, while most of the Athenian crews were ashore foraging for food. Without its fleet, Athens had no income from the empire, no way to import the grain it depended on, and no strategic option beyond slow starvation. In 404 BC, Athens surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the music of flutes, as Lysander reportedly thought the occasion deserved a festive atmosphere. An oligarchic government of 30 men, quickly nicknamed the 30 Tyrants, was installed with Spartan support. The 30 governed Athens for about 8 months with a violence and arbitrariness that managed to make the previous 150 years of democracy look retrospectively reasonable, even to people who had spent those years complaining about it. They executed prominent citizens, exiled others, and confiscated property with an efficiency that owed more to personal enrichment than to any political program. A democratic resistance formed, fought its way back into the city in 403 BC, and the democracy was restored, a restoration that was, given the circumstances, managed with considerably more restraint than the defeated oligarchs had any right to expect. Athens survived, but the Greek world it returned to was not the one that had existed before 431 BC. The silver reserve was gone. The empire was gone. The navy would be rebuilt, but never with the same overwhelming dominance. The allied cities that had been held in tributary subjection had been exposed, in the war's final phase, to a level of Athenian desperation that had removed whatever pretense of voluntary cooperation remained. More broadly, a generation of Greek men across the entire peninsula had been fed into a conflict that had solved nothing except to exhaust everyone involved. Sparta's declared aim of liberating the Greeks had produced a Spartan empire more nakedly exploitative than the Athenian one it replaced. The trust between Greek police, never robust, had been corroded past any easy repair. The Greek world was weaker than it had been in 431 BC, poorer, more suspicious, and less able to act collectively. It had approximately 50 years before it would need to do precisely that, against a threat that would make the Persian Wars look manageable. The Macedonian interruption, Philip and Alexander. The Greek city-states spent the 50 years after the Peloponnesian War doing what they had always done, only with less energy and less money than before. Sparta attempted to hold the dominant position its victory had supposedly secured, discovered that dominance was more expensive to maintain than to achieve, and found itself challenged by Thebes, whose general Epaminondas developed a new tactical approach, concentrating overwhelming force at a single point in the battle line, rather than distributing it evenly that defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 171 BC, and shattered the reputation for invincibility that had been the real foundation of Spartan power. Thebes then attempted leadership of the Greek world, found it equally thankless, and by the 350s BC, the Greek peninsula was back to its habitual condition of multipolar exhaustion. Into this environment came Macedonia. Macedonia was a kingdom in the mountainous region north of the Greek peninsula proper, and its relationship to Greek identity had always been ambiguous. The Macedonian ruling class spoke Greek, participated in Greek religious customs, and competed in Greek athletic games. The Macedonian kings claimed descent from Heracles and were accepted at Olympia on the basis of their proclaimed Greek heritage. The ordinary Macedonian population spoke a dialect that Greeks from the southern Polis found difficult to follow and sometimes refused to recognize as Greek at all. Southern Greeks tended to regard Macedonians as northern barbarians with aristocratic pretensions, which was both somewhat unfair and politically useful as a way of dismissing a power they preferred not to take seriously. They were still in the process of not taking it seriously when Philip II took the Macedonian throne in 359 BC and began the systematic project of making their opinion irrelevant. Philip had spent time as a hostage in Thebes during his youth and had observed Epaminondas's tactical innovations directly. He returned to Macedonia with a thorough education in what made military forces effective and immediately applied it. The army he rebuilt used a longer spear than the standard Greek hoplite lance, the sarissa, roughly 5 to 6 meters in length. Wielded with 2 hands deployed in a deep phalanx formation whose front ranks bristled with overlapping spear points that no conventional force could get through. Crucially, the Macedonian cavalry recruited from the Macedonian aristocracy and trained to operate in coordinated combination with the infantry, was designed to strike at the vulnerable flanks and rear that the phalanx locked down from, the front. The two elements worked together as a combined system rather than as separate arms that happened to be fighting the same battle. Philip spent the 350s BC securing his northern and western borders, neutralizing tribal threats, and extending Macedonian control over Thrace and its gold mines, which gave him the financial base to maintain and expand his army. He also demonstrated a consistent preference for diplomacy, bribery, and well-timed marriage alliances over military force when those tools could achieve his objectives. He reportedly said that no fortress was impregnable if there was a donkey that could carry gold up to its gates, which was practical wisdom of the kind that made him simultaneously effective and difficult to trust. His involvement in the southern Greek world deepened through the 340s BC. exploiting the Sacred War, a conflict ostensibly about the control of Delphi that was actually about Theban and Phocian political competition, as a pretext for Macedonian intervention in central Greek affairs. The Athenian orator Demosthenes delivered a series of speeches warning Athens and other Greek states that Philip's steady accumulation of influence and territory represented an existential threat to Greek independence. The speeches were brilliant, largely accurate, and not particularly effective. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where Philip's army met a coalition of Athenian and Theban forces in the most significant military engagement on Greek soil since the Persian Wars. Philip commanded the right wing of his line personally. His 18-year-old son Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry on the left. The coalition forces were broken, and with them the last organised military resistance to Macedonian hegemony over the Greek peninsula. Philip did not treat his victory as a license for plunder. He returned the Athenian dead without ransom, released prisoners, and positioned himself as the leader of a united Greek world rather than its conqueror. The League of Corinth, established in 337 BC, enrolled the major Greek city-states. Sparta conspicuously refused to join under Macedonian leadership, with Philip as its hegemon. The stated purpose was a joint campaign against Persia, framed as retribution for the Persian invasion of 140 years earlier, which was politically useful framing, even if the actual motivation was more straightforwardly about expansion. Philip was assassinated in 336 BC at a public festival, killed by one of his own bodyguards in circumstances whose full political background ancient sources preserved imperfectly. His son Alexander, 20 years old, inherited the throne, the army, the league, and the planned Persian campaign. What followed over the next 13 years is one of the most documented and most debated sequences of events in ancient history, and its scale is still difficult to fully absorb. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. He defeated Persian forces at the Granicus River in Asia Minor, liberated the Ionian Greek cities from Persian control, and moved south through Anatolia. At Gordium, where tradition held that whoever untied an ancient knotted rope would rule Asia, Alexander examined the knot, decided the method of untying was not technically specified, drew his sword, and cut it. Whether this story is historical or symbolic, it became the single most recognizable illustration of how Alexander approached obstacles that conventional solutions could not resolve. He met the Persian king Darius III at Issus in 333 BC, a coastal plain in what is now southern Turkey, where Alexander's tactical assault broke the Persian centre, and Darius withdrew from the field, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children in the camp. Alexander reportedly treated the royal family with formal courtesy, which was both genuinely civilized and excellent propaganda. Rather than immediately pursuing Darius into the Persian heartland, Alexander turned south along the coast, systematically securing the eastern Mediterranean seaboard to eliminate the Persian navy's ability to operate from its home ports. The siege of Tyre, on a fortified island off the Phoenician coast, lasted 7 months and required the construction of a causeway from the mainland before the city fell. Gaza required 2 months more. Alexander then moved into Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, visited the oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa, where the oracle apparently addressed him in terms suggesting divine parentage, a development Alexander found worth publicizing, and founded the city of Alexandria near the western edge of the Nile Delta. He would eventually name at least 20 cities after himself across his campaign route. He also named one after his horse, Bucephalus, after the animal died in India. It is the only city in history named after a horse, which is either a touching tribute to a beloved companion or a reflection of Alexander's priorities that does not bear too much examination. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, on a plain in what is now northern Iraq, was the decisive engagement of the Persian campaign. Darius had prepared the ground carefully, levelling the terrain to give his war elephants and scythe-wheeled chariots room to operate. Alexander's response was a coordinated cavalry assault through a gap in the Persian line that reached Darius directly, causing him again to withdraw. The Persian formation disintegrated. Darius fled east and was subsequently killed by his own officers. Alexander took Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, and burned the great palace complex. Their ancient sources suggest the burning was a deliberate act of retribution for Xerxes' destruction of Athens, though the more prosaic version has the fire started accidentally during a late-night celebration. The campaign continued east through Bactria into what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, encountering guerrilla resistance of a kind the Macedonian force was structurally less well designed to handle than pitched battles. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush, reached India, and won a hard-fought battle against the Indian king Porus at the Hydaspes River in 326 BC. His army, which had been marching and fighting for 8 years, declined to go further. They had reached a point beyond which, as far as they could determine, the known world simply continued indefinitely. Alexander reportedly wept. Ancient sources disagree on whether from frustration or from grief that there were no more worlds to conquer, which is the kind of story that says more about what later generations wanted Alexander to have felt than about what he actually felt. The army turned back. Alexander reached Babylon in 323 BC and died there in June, at the age of 32. The cause of death remains debated: fever, following heavy drinking, typhoid, poisoning, or some combination of factors that the ancient sources record with their usual helpful inconsistency. He had ruled for 13 years, covered roughly 20,000 miles, and built an empire that stretched from Greece to the border of India. He left no designated successor, the Hellenistic world. Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BC without naming a successor, and the men who had served as his generals spent the next 40 years fighting each other with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it had not been so destructive. The conflicts among Alexander's successors, the Diadochi, as historians call them, went through several phases of shifting alliances, betrayals, and military campaigns across the full breadth of the former empire, before the dust settled into something resembling a stable arrangement. What emerged by around 275 BC were three main kingdoms. The Ptolemaic dynasty controlled Egypt and, for much of the period, parts of the Levantine coast. The Seleucid dynasty held the vast eastern portion of the former Persian Empire, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the territories stretching into Central Asia. Though the eastern edges proved increasingly difficult to hold, the Antigonid dynasty controlled Macedonia and exercised loose hegemony over the Greek peninsula. Smaller kingdoms and independent polis filled the spaces between these larger powers, and the boundaries shifted with each generation's conflicts. But the broad shape of the Hellenistic world, a cluster of large Greek-speaking kingdoms occupying the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia, remained recognizable for 2 centuries. The word Hellenistic, coined by the 19th century historian Johann Gustav Droysen, describes something more specific than simply Greek. It describes the culture that emerged when Greek language, institutions, and intellectual assumptions spread across a vast territory that already possessed its own deep civilizations: Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Syrian, and the 2 sets of traditions began, in varying degrees and at varying speeds, to interact. The result was neither purely Greek nor purely local, but something genuinely new. A cosmopolitan, multilingual, highly mobile world in which a Greek-educated merchant from Alexandria might do business in Antioch, consult a Babylonian astronomer in Seleucia, and retire to Athens, and in which each of those cities would be recognizably part of the same broad cultural world. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander on the Egyptian coast in 331 BC, and developed by the Ptolemaic kings into the largest city in the Mediterranean world, became the most visible expression of this new culture. By the 2nd century BC, Alexandria had a population of perhaps 500,000 people, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, and representatives of almost every other group, the Eastern Mediterranean contained living in a planned city with wide streets, a magnificent harbour, and a physical scale that made Athens look provincial. The Ptolemaic kings developed at Alexandria two institutions that made the city the intellectual centre of the Hellenistic world. The museum, not a museum in the modern sense, but a research institution attached to a temple of the Muses, where scholars were housed, fed, and paid to pursue their work, and the library, which aimed to collect every book written in the Greek language and made serious efforts to collect works in other languages as well. The Ptolemies were so committed to this collecting mission that they established a policy of confiscating all books found on ships entering Alexandria's harbour, copying them, returning the copies to the owners, and keeping the originals for the library. Ships' crews visiting Alexandria were therefore advised to declare their reading material carefully, though whether they received any compensation for the exchange is a question the ancient sources do not answer with satisfying clarity. The scholars who worked at the Alexandrian Museum produced work of lasting consequence. Euclid wrote the Elements there, the systematic presentation of geometry that remained the standard mathematical textbook in much of the world for over 2,000 years. Archimedes of Syracuse, though he worked primarily in his home city, was part of the same intellectual network and produced mathematics and physics that would not be significantly advanced until the 17th century. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the earth by measuring the difference in shadow angles between two Egyptian cities on the same day, arriving at a figure that was within a few % of the correct answer. He had access to the right geographical information, understood the geometry clearly, and produced a result of remarkable accuracy, roughly 1800 years before anyone thought to repeat the exercise. Hellenistic Alexandria also hosted what became one of the formative moments in Jewish intellectual history. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek there, the translation known as the Septuagint, for the use of the large Jewish community in Egypt, whose primary language had become Greek rather than Hebrew. The long-term consequences of that translation for the subsequent spread of Jewish religious ideas through the Greek-speaking world, and eventually for the development of early Christianity, were considerable. On the Greek mainland, the political landscape of the Hellenistic period was shaped by the effort to find some form of collective organization that could provide security without the kind of hegemonic dominance that had made both the Athenian Empire and the Spartan supremacy so deeply resented. Two federal leagues became the primary vehicles for this effort. The Achaean League, centered in the northern Peloponnese, gradually absorbed most of the southern Greek cities, including Corinth and eventually Sparta. The Aetolian League controlled much of central Greece. Neither was a unified state member. Cities retained their internal autonomy, but both maintained common foreign policy, shared military forces, and elected federal officials. They were genuine experiments in federal organization, and they functioned with reasonable effectiveness for roughly a century. The philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period reflected the changed circumstances of Greek intellectual life. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum continued in Athens, but new schools emerged that addressed a world in which the comfortable assumption of the classical polis, that the good life was lived as an engaged citizen of a self-governing community, had been undermined by the scale of the new kingdoms and the obvious limits of individual political agency. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, who began teaching in Athens around 300 BC, argued that virtue was the only true good, that external circumstances including wealth, status, and political conditions were indifferent to genuine happiness, and that the wise person found their freedom in the control of their own judgment rather than in the control of their environment. It was a philosophy well designed for a world in which most people had little control over their political environment and needed a framework for living well regardless. Epicurus, teaching in Athens at roughly the same time, offered a different response to the same problem. the cultivation of simple pleasures, friendship, and philosophical contemplation as the path to a tranquil life, with deliberate withdrawal from the anxieties of political ambition and public life. Both schools found audiences well beyond the Greek world proper. As Greek became the common language of educated people across the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, Stoic and Epicurean ideas travelled with it, reaching audiences in Rome, in Egypt, in Syria, and eventually influencing intellectual traditions far removed from the Athenian streets where they had developed. The Hellenistic period was, simultaneously, a time of genuine intellectual and artistic achievement and a time of political fragility. The successor kingdoms were wealthy and culturally productive, but their dynastic politics were brutal. The Ptolemaic family history in particular features a succession of poisonings, murders, and sibling marriages that would have supplied a modern television drama with multiple seasons of material. The Greek mainland was squeezed between the larger powers, dependent on their goodwill, and periodically the site of fighting as the Macedonian kingdom attempted to maintain its hegemony against the resistance of the leagues. From the western end of the Mediterranean, a new power had been quietly accumulating the territorial control and military capability that would eventually make all of these calculations irrelevant. Rome had defeated Carthage in the First Punic War by 241 BC and was developing the combination of military organization, political flexibility, and disciplined persistence that made it unlike anything the Hellenistic world was accustomed to dealing with. The first direct military contact between Rome and the Greek world came when the Macedonian king Philip V allied with Carthage during the Second Punic War, prompting Rome to look eastward with the focused attention of a power that had just learned how dangerous neglected threats could become. The Hellenistic world had another century to run before that attention resolved into conquest, but the direction of travel was already clear enough to those who were paying attention and were not too invested in believing otherwise, which was most people. Byzantine Greece, the long Middle Age. The Roman Empire did not fall in a single moment. It drifted, reorganized, and transformed across several centuries, shedding some characteristics while retaining others, until what remained was recognizably different from what had existed before, but still, in its own understanding, continuous with it. The eastern half of the empire proved considerably more durable than the western. While the city of Rome fell to the Visigoth leader Alaric in 410 AD, and the last Western Roman emperor was deposed in 476 AD, the Eastern Empire continued without interruption, ruled from Constantinople for nearly another 1,000 years. That Eastern Empire is what historians call Byzantine, a label the people who lived in it would not have recognized or used. They called themselves Romans, considered their state the direct continuation of the Roman Empire, and spoke Greek as their primary language. The gradual shift from Latin to Greek as the empire's working language was a process rather than a policy decision. Greek had always been the dominant language of the eastern provinces. By the reign of the Emperor Heraclius in the early 7th century AD, Greek had become the formal language of imperial administration, replacing Latin in official documents and military command. The empire was Roman in its legal traditions and imperial ideology, Greek in its language and cultural orientation, and Christian in its religious framework, a combination that made it unlike anything that had existed before it, and unlike anything that came after. The founding of Constantinople itself was the pivotal act. In 330 AD, the Emperor Constantine the Great formally dedicated a new imperial capital on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, a strategically positioned settlement at the narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was built rapidly, designed consciously as a new Rome, complete with 7 hills, a forum, a hippodrome, and eventually a senate. It was also, from relatively early in its existence, a Christian city, as Constantine had extended imperial favour to Christianity, and his successors had completed the process by making it the empire's official religion in 380 AD. For Greece, and the Greek peninsula specifically, the transition into the Byzantine period meant a significant reorganization of both physical and cultural life. The old pagan temples were closed, repurposed, or demolished across the course of the 4th and 5th centuries. The Parthenon in Athens was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, an alteration that required considerable structural modification to its interior, but preserved the building itself from the demolition that ended the functional existence of many classical structures. The Erechtheion became a church. The Temple of Hephaestus near the Athenian Agora survived its conversion and stands today as one of the best preserved classical Greek temples in existence. Precisely because its Christian repurposing kept it structurally intact through the subsequent centuries, the closure of the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 AD by order of the Emperor Justinian I marked the formal end of the continuous institutional tradition of pagan Greek philosophy that had been running in various forms since the 4th century BC. The surviving philosophers left Athens and took up residence at the Sasanian Persian court, where they were received with interest. Justinian's motive was partly religious. The academy was an explicitly pagan institution, and partly, perhaps, a sense that the intellectual traditions it represented were now adequately housed within the Christian theological framework that Byzantine scholars had been building for 2 centuries. The closure was symbolic as much as practical, since by 529 AD the academy had long been a relatively modest institution, rather than the intellectual powerhouse it had been in its classical prime. Justinian himself deserves attention, as the Byzantine emperor who most ambitiously attempted to restore the Roman Empire to something approaching its former geographic extent. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and significant portions of Italy from the Ostrogoths, temporarily bringing Rome itself back under Constantinople's control. He commissioned the Hagia Sophia, the great domed church in Constantinople that still stands, and that was, at its construction between 532 and 537 AD, the largest enclosed space in the world. He also oversaw the compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the systematic organization of Roman law that became the foundation of legal systems across medieval and modern Europe. The cost of these ambitions was severe, and it fell partly on Greece. The reconquest campaigns were expensive. The bureaucratic and tax demands on the empire's provinces to fund them were considerable. And then, beginning in 541 AD, the plague of Justinian swept through the eastern Mediterranean, a bubonic plague outbreak that killed perhaps a quarter to a third of the empire's population over the following decades, and destroyed the demographic base on which Justinian's military ambitions had depended. Greece in the late 6th and 7th centuries AD experienced something it had not faced since the Bronze Age collapse: substantial depopulation and the arrival of new peoples into territories that the empire could no longer adequately defend. The Avars, a nomadic confederacy from the Eurasian steppe, raided repeatedly into the Balkans. Behind them, and often in combination with them, came Slavic groups migrating southward from Central Europe. Between roughly 580 and 700 AD, Slavic settlers moved into significant portions of the Greek mainland, establishing communities across Thessaly, Macedonia, and the Peloponnese. Byzantine authority in the interior of the peninsula contracted sharply, maintaining control primarily of the coastal cities and major fortified centres. The extent of Slavic settlement in Greece during this period was substantial enough that later Byzantine sources describe much of the Peloponnese as effectively Slavicized, and place names of Slavic origin survived in parts of Greece into the medieval and modern periods. The process was not a sudden conquest, but a gradual infiltration into territories that the reduced Byzantine administrative and military presence could not fill. Greek-speaking populations were displaced, absorbed, or retreated to defensible coastal positions, and the Greek character of the interior was maintained primarily in the memories of those who had left it. The Byzantine recovery of Greece was a slow process that unfolded across the 8th and 9th centuries. Military reorganization under the theme system, dividing the empire into administrative and military districts called themes, each commanded by a strategos who combined military and civil authority, gave the empire greater flexibility and local resilience. The settlement of new military colonists in depopulated areas, combined with active missionary work converting Slavic communities to Orthodox Christianity and teaching them Greek, gradually restored Byzantine cultural dominance over the peninsula. By the 9th century, the Peloponnese had been substantially re-Hellenized through a combination of resettlement, conversion, and cultural assimilation that left the region Greek-speaking and Christian, though with a more mixed ethnic composition than it had possessed before the migrations. The iconoclasm controversy, a prolonged theological and political dispute over whether religious images should be venerated in Christian worship, convulsed the Byzantine Empire from 726 to 143 AD, touching every corner of its territory, including the Greek peninsula. The dispute had layers: genuine theological difference about the nature of sacred imagery, political conflict between the imperial court and the monastic institutions that produced and defended icons, and regional tensions between Constantinople and its provinces. Greece, whose monasteries were significant centres of icon production, and whose bishops were largely on the image-defending side, experienced the controversy as both a religious matter and a test of the relationship between local religious culture and imperial authority. The resolution of iconoclasm in 843 AD in favour of icon veneration marked a stabilisation of Byzantine religious culture that held essentially intact for the rest of the empire's existence. The theological framework established in those centuries Orthodox Christianity, with its characteristic liturgical, artistic, and philosophical traditions, became the defining cultural inheritance of Greece through the remainder of the medieval period and, in significant respects, into the modern world. The Macedonian dynasty, which ruled from 867 to 1056 AD, presided over a period of genuine Byzantine confidence and expansion. The empire reconquered Crete from Arab occupation in 961 AD, clearing the eastern Mediterranean of a pirate base that had disrupted commerce for over a century. Bulgarian power was crushed by the Emperor Basil II in a campaign so comprehensive that his enemies called him Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar Slayer, in a title he apparently did not find objectionable. Trade flourished. Greek cities along the coast and in the interior saw renewed investment. Constantinople reached its medieval peak as one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world. It was a high point that the empire would struggle to sustain, and that the events of the following century would begin, systematically, to dismantle. The fall of Constantinople and the long shadow of Greece. The city of Constantinople entered the 15th century as a shadow of what it had been. A century of civil war, Ottoman pressure, Latin occupation's lingering damage, and the Black Death had reduced the population of a city that had once held perhaps 500,000 people to somewhere between 40 and 50,000. The walls still stood, the great Theodosian land walls built in the early 5th century AD. 3 parallel lines of fortification that had protected the city for over 1,000 years and had never been successfully stormed from the landside. Inside those walls, large areas that had once been densely built were now gardens, orchards, and open ground. The palaces were partially maintained, partially ruinous. The harbour still functioned, dominated by Genoese merchants operating from their colony at Galata across the Golden Horn. The Ottoman Empire surrounding this diminished city was a different order of power entirely. Mehmed II, who took the Ottoman throne in 1451 AD at the age of 19, had been preparing for the conquest of Constantinople since before his accession. He understood it as both a strategic necessity — the city sat at the centre of Ottoman Balkan and Anatolian territories, and its continued existence as a Christian capital was an anomaly. His empire's geography could not comfortably accommodate, and as a civilizational statement. Taking Constantinople would make him, in his own understanding, and in the understanding of the Islamic world, the heir to a Roman imperial tradition that still carried enormous prestige. The preparations were methodical. Mehmed commissioned a massive new cannon from a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI and had been turned away for lack of funds. The cannon Urban built for the Ottomans could fire stone balls weighing several hundred kilograms over a distance of more than a mile, and Mehmed had several constructed, along with a substantial conventional artillery train. He also built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus Rumeli Hisari in 1452 AD, cutting off Constantinople from Black Sea supply routes. The siege began in early April of 1453 AD. Constantine XI commanded a defending force estimated at somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, a mixture of Greek citizens, Venetian and Genoese volunteers, and various other Western fighters who had chosen to remain against an Ottoman army of perhaps 60,000 to 80,000. The disproportion was stark, and both sides understood it. Constantine had sent repeated appeals to the Western European powers for assistance on a scale that might genuinely alter the military balance. Those appeals produced promises that arrived slowly, incompletely, and largely too late. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani Longo led the defence of the land walls with considerable skill for nearly 2 months, coordinating repairs to walls damaged by artillery during the day and organising sorties at night. The Ottomans attempted a naval assault on the chain blocking the Golden Horn, found it held, and responded by hauling a portion of their fleet overland on greased logs around the Genoese colony of Galata and into the Golden Horn, an engineering operation of sufficient audacity that the defenders were genuinely surprised when they saw Ottoman ships appearing where no Ottoman ships should have been. On the 29th of May, 1453 AD, the final assault came. Giustiniani was wounded early in the attack and was carried from the walls. His departure, whatever its cause, broke the coherence of the defence at the most critical moment. The Ottomans broke through the walls at a small gate in the section near the Blackenay Palace. Constantine XI, removing his imperial insignia so he could not be identified for capture, fought in the general melee as the Ottoman forces poured into the city. He was not seen alive again. The empire that had maintained unbroken continuity with Rome for over 1,000 years ended, in its last moments, with its last emperor fighting on foot in the streets of his own capital. Mehmed entered the city that afternoon. He went directly to the Hagia Sophia, which was converted to a mosque immediately, and is recorded to have picked up a handful of earth and poured it over his turban in a gesture of humility before God. Whatever his private feelings on the day, his subsequent treatment of the city was notably restrained by the standards of medieval conquest. Looting was permitted for the traditional 3 days, and then stopped. The Greek population that remained was not expelled. The Orthodox Patriarchate was restored and maintained, with the Patriarch given authority over the Greek Christian community under Ottoman administration. The millet system the Ottomans used to govern their non-Muslim subjects gave the Greek Orthodox community a degree of internal self-governance. The ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople retained religious authority over Orthodox Christians throughout the empire, conducted services, maintained church institutions, and functioned as the official intermediary between the Greek community and Ottoman authority. It was not independence, and the conditions attached to this arrangement were real, but it preserved a continuous institutional structure for Greek religious and cultural life through the centuries of Ottoman rule. The remaining fragments of Byzantine political authority fell quickly after Constantinople. The Despotate of Morea, that late Byzantine enclave in the Peloponnese centred on Mistras, fell in 1460 AD when Mehmed's forces moved south. The Empire of Trebizond, the last surviving Byzantine successor state on the Black Sea coast, fell in 1461 AD. The political map of the Greek world, which had been complicated to the point of illegibility for the previous 2 centuries, was now Ottoman throughout. But something had already left. and what left mattered enormously to what the world was about to become. Through the decades preceding 1453 AD, and continuing in the years immediately after, Greek scholars had been moving westward, some fleeing the advancing Ottoman tide, some responding to invitations from Italian humanist patrons who had developed an intense interest in the Greek intellectual tradition, some simply following the opportunities that the cultural excitement of the early Italian Renaissance was generating. They carried with them manuscripts, copies of Plato and Aristotle, of the Greek historians, of the mathematical and scientific works of the Hellenistic period, of the Greek dramatists, of Homer. Many of these texts existed in Western Europe, only in Latin translation, in incomplete form, or not at all. The Greek scholar Gemistos Plethon attended the Council of Florence in 1439 AD and gave lectures on Plato that inspired Cosimo de' Medici to establish the Platonic Academy of Florence, the institution that would educate the scholars and artists of the Florentine Renaissance. Cardinal Bessarion, a Greek churchman who had converted to Roman Catholicism, spent decades in Rome collecting Greek manuscripts and eventually donated over 1,000 volumes to the Venetian Republic, forming the nucleus of the library now known as the Bibliotheca Marciana. Manuel Chrysoloras, who taught Greek in Florence at the start of the 15th century, was the direct teacher of several figures central to the Italian humanist movement. The recovery of the full range of Greek classical texts, particularly the Platonic dialogues in their complete form, the pre-Socratic philosophers, the Greek historians and dramatists fed directly into the intellectual transformation that the Renaissance represented. The European rediscovery of Greek learning was not entirely a product of Byzantine emigration. Some texts had been preserved in Western monasteries, others had come through Arabic translation, but the Greek scholars arriving from the East accelerated the process enormously, brought with them direct knowledge of the Greek language that made primary source scholarship possible, and created the intellectual networks through which classical learning was disseminated, translated, and applied. The effects cascaded outward. Erasmus learned Greek and produced a corrected edition of the New Testament that contributed to the Protestant Reformation. The recovery of Archimedes' mathematical works influenced the scientific revolutions developing mathematics. Aristotle, already known in the medieval West through Arabic translations, was now available in full in Greek, reshaping natural philosophy. The Greek political texts, Thucydides, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics entered the vocabulary of Renaissance political thought and eventually influenced the constitutional thinking of the American founding generation, who considered themselves, with only moderate exaggeration, the heirs of the Athenian and Roman traditions simultaneously. Under Ottoman rule, the Greek population maintained its language, its Orthodox Christianity, and a distinct cultural identity through 4 centuries of accommodation, negotiation, and periodic conflict. The Phanariates Greek families based in the Phanar district of Constantinople near the Patriarchate developed into a significant administrative and intellectual elite within the Ottoman system, serving as interpreters, diplomats, and eventually as governors of Ottoman provinces in the Balkans. They also maintained Greek educational and literary culture, sponsoring schools and printing presses that kept the Greek language literate, and producing the educated class from which the Greek national movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries would draw its leadership. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821 AD, was therefore not a sudden emergence from historical silence, but the culmination of a gradual reconstruction of Greek national consciousness shaped by the preserved language, the orthodox religious identity, the classical heritage that European Philhellenism had spent 3 centuries celebrating, and the political ideas of the Enlightenment arriving back in Greece partly through the very channels of Greek classical learning that had fed the Enlightenment in the first place. The revolution drew on a tradition that was simultaneously ancient, medieval, and modern. The civilization that had begun on those Aegean cliff-tops with palace-building Minoans and warrior kings who remembered Troy had passed through democracy and empire, through conquest and survival, through 1,000 years of Christian imperial culture and 4 centuries of Ottoman accommodation, and had arrived at the modern world carrying more of its inheritance intact than almost any comparable story in human history could claim. What the Greeks built, the questions they asked, the political forms they invented, the literature they produced, the philosophical frameworks they developed, did not remain in Greece. It left, travelled, was translated, was argued with, was revised, was absorbed into traditions that had no direct connection to the Aegean world, and returned in forms that its original makers would not always have recognised. That process of leaving and returning and being transformed in the travelling is still ongoing. The story that began in the silence after the Bronze Age collapse, with scattered communities rebuilding from almost nothing, never entirely stopped. And so, quietly, we reach the end of this long and remarkable journey. 3,000 years of history, carried through empires and dark ages and conquests and slow recoveries. If you are still awake at this point, that is genuinely impressive, and also perhaps a sign that you should try closing your eyes and letting the rest settle in on its own. The story is safe now. It will be there in the morning. Are you still with us? If you enjoyed tonight's journey through ancient and medieval Greece, there is another video waiting for you on screen wherever your interest leads next. The history continues. And if this one was worth your time, a like, a subscription, or a thought left in the comments below means more than you might think. For now, though, let your body relax completely. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. The Aegean is quiet tonight. The old stones are still standing. Close your eyes. Good night. Sweet dreams.